Hello and welcome to the ninth lecture in the Nietzsche module, and in this one we're going to start to talk about the third essay. So we're returning to the genealogy, and we're going to look at what Nietzsche has to say about the ascetic ideal. So in particular, what does the ascetic ideal mean for us now? So we're getting out of the more historical phase of Nietzsche's analysis and looking around at the present day. Okay, so here are the three central things we're going to talk about today. So the first one is the role of the ascetic priest. Now you'll notice on the slide that there are irony ears around the phrase ascetic priest, and that's because being an ascetic priest is a particular type of psycho and sociological role, which doesn't necessarily involve membership of a priesthood. You don't have to be ordained into a religion to be an ascetic priest. In fact, as we'll see, you may even be opposed in some sense to organised religion. You might think of yourself as anti-religious, and yet you might play the role of ascetic priest as Nietzsche understands it. Why is that? Well, the major part of the argument for that is the second point here, which is that the will to truth is a manifestation of the ascetic ideal. Remember that the fundamental drive of every creature, every animal, for Nietzsche, is the will to power. Is that you should flex, express, experience your strength. Or at least, or for us, rather self-conscious beings, to have the feeling of an expression of power and so on. The will to truth is not natural to us. The will to truth isn't just something that we get simply by being human beings. This is part of Nietzsche's distance from the Enlightenment, or from older models of the human species, of the human mind. In those older models you might expect, well look, just truth-telling is natural to us, or we have a natural sense of virtue or something. This clearly isn't true, right? I mean, kids lie, and people who haven't been socialized out of lying lie. Diplomats bend the truth, and when it's socially useful, we may not lie exactly, but we gloss over things. We change the way we present things. If somebody's telling a story, an anecdote, and it's an anecdote in which, say, some particular national group comes off quite badly, ends up, doesn't look too well, and it happens to be a member of that nationality present while you're telling the story. Well, you may make some changes to the story, right? Because there's no reason to embarrass this person just in order to tell a story, so you might fiddle with some of the details, right? So we too actually are not committed to truth as the only thing we care about, right? So the will to truth is something that has to be inculcated and educated. There has to be. It's another one of these long cultural preparations where you have to take generations to produce a creature that will be committed to the value of truth so much so that it will hurt itself, right? In order to, in the service of that value. So, if you're a scholar of some sort and you come across some evidence that cuts against your big idea and that, might stop your research program in its tracks, and you think, well, I was hoping for a professorship, I was hoping to become, rich and famous on the basis of this, but here is some evidence that refutes my meal ticket of an idea. I am a scholar, or I am committed to the value of truth, and therefore I will publish this evidence, I will withdraw my big idea. And if you're properly brought up academic, you should do this without really thinking about it, right? You should have it should be second nature to you, right? But it hurts you, right? Damaging for you. It reduces your will, your sense of strength. So there must have been something you must have been got at a young age, and the cultural conditions to produce someone, to make it possible for them to get at you at a young age, so that you will do things that are damaging to you, to your flourishing, in pursuit of this abstract will to truth. That, again, must be one of these things that's taken a long time to prepare and produce. And if you ask, well, what was the vehicle by which this long cultural preparation for the production of creatures that will damage their own vital interests in the service of the truth, well, the answer for Nietzsche, and plausibly enough for us too, is going to be religion. It's religion that says, it's Judeo-Christian religion that says, thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not bear false witness, even if there are really good practical and ethical reasons for bearing false witness, right? Thou shalt not. Remember Kant says you mustn't tell a lie, even if the the Gestapo knock on your door and say, do you know where the Jews are hiding? You're not allowed just to say, no, I've no idea. Even if that would be the best thing for everybody, including the Gestapo, because they're going to lose the war and will eventually be answerable for their crimes, and it would be better if they committed fewer crimes, right? So there's something odd here. There's something to be explained, and so this is what Nietzsche means when he talks about the will to truth as a manifestation of the ascetic ideal. And then finally, on the last page, what you really ought by now to have turned to the last page. Well, hopefully you've read the whole book, but if you have something you should do from time to time is turn to the last page of the genealogy and just see where it's all going. Just read the last page and see, all right, okay, so that's what this was all about. And what it's all about, you find, is to do with the value of suffering, the meaning of suffering. And something Nietzsche says there is that what's really intolerable to us is meaningless suffering. We don't like suffering anyway, but if you're suffering to some purpose, if you can convince yourself that your suffering is part of some greater scheme that makes some kind of sense, then it might be more bearable. So part of the value of the ascetic ideal is to give sense to suffering, right? Okay. So, what does asceticism mean? Well, ascesis, the original Greek term, means bodily exercise, athletic training. It means putting yourself through some sort of rigorous regime, some restricted diet and strenuous exercises and so on. And asceticism, it says here, is voluntary, austere self-discipline and self-denial to the end of some higher spiritual ideal. So the obvious cases are, people who is monks, monasticism. If you live on a very simple diet and you don't indulge the senses, you get extreme versions where, like fakirs, like the guy who raises his arm and just keeps it there indefinitely as a kind of extreme austerity, just as a way of developing a kind of religious power, right? So the ascetic ideal is the idea that the best kind of human life requires asceticism. And you can see from a practical point of view that anybody who hopes to achieve anything at all is going to practice some sort of asceticism, right? I mean, if you want to achieve anything worthwhile, you're going to have to put yourself through some discipline in order to achieve it. You're going to have to practice your scales, or read many boring books, or do an awful lot of time in the gym, whatever it is. So that's obvious, right? But that's also not philosophically not very interesting. Really what Nietzsche has in mind by the ascetic ideal is the idea that what's really worth striving for is something outside this life. So the obvious cases are those religions which posit an afterlife, which tell you that what really matters is your preparation for the hereafter, that this life on earth is a world of shadows and illusions, and it's only temporary, and the advantages that you can have here, aside from being temporary, are also contingent. So you might think your life's going well, but then you step in front of a boss, or someone who's essential to your well-being steps in front of a boss, or you lose all your money, or whatever it is, right? The things that really matter lie outside this earthly existence, and therefore, by giving up the pleasures and advantages of this earthly existence, by locking yourself away in a laboratory, or a library, or a monastery, or a rehearsal room, or a gym, you're not losing anything, right? You're not losing anything that really is really important, because the really important stuff is all located somewhere else. So Jesus tells you, don't bother storing up treasure on earth. What you have to do is store up treasure in heaven. And part of what Nietzsche wants to tell you is to remind you that there are lots of versions of that idea that aren't necessarily obviously religious. Plato, for example. Plato wants to tell you that what's really important are the eternal forms, the form of the good, the form of virtue, and that what you really need to do is cultivate your intellect and get intimate with the form of the good and the form of the beautiful, and that's what really matters. That's what Socrates tells Alcibiades. Essentially, Alcibiades is a creature of earthly sensuality and drunkenness and sexual pleasure, and Socrates says, well, no, actually what you need to understand, Alcibiades, is that the real business, the real things of value lie elsewhere. So that's an important feature of the ascetic ideal, is that you're not really losing anything by giving up the pleasures and advantages of this life. Okay. So, the ascetic priest plays a role in the narrative. The ascetic priest is the direction changer of ressentiment, right? So remember that we met ressentiment, and we're still in the dark about why Nietzsche uses this French word when there are German words available. But we thought possibly one reason might be that he wants to present us with the man of ressentiment, the person for whom resentment is not just directed at particular individuals for particular slights, right? So it's easy to think of resentment as, I, the slave, resent the master for the work he makes me do and the beatings that he hands out. I, the peasant, as a peasant, resent the lord in his castle for the work he makes me do and the taxes that he collects. I, as a as a petit bourgeois shopkeeper, I resent the highly educated aesthete because again, he takes taxes out of my business and spends them on, fine art and National Opera Company and so on and so forth. And I resent this, and I also resent being made to feel stupid and ignorant and uncultured. But these are particular resentments directed at particular people for specific reasons. Nietzsche wants to present us the man of ressentiment, the person for whom resentment is their general existential condition, right? So the person who, if you try and give them something, they'll say, "What's the catch? What's in it for you?" The person whose picture of the world is devoid of notions of nobility and greatness, and who has no kind of generosity of spirit about them, right? That's the person of ressentiment, the person who counts their change, the person who does somebody else a favour because they hope that something else will come round, rather than just as an expression of who they are, right? That kind of thing, right? So we have this person of ressentiment, and in whom resentment has become a general existential condition. But they're still directing their resentment outwards. They're still kind of extrovert in their diagnosis of what's wrong with the world. The ascetic priest has the role of turning that inwards, of turning the person of ressentiment, the person who is shot through and through with resentment, into a person who is shot through and through, who is completely kind of coloured by perceptions of sin. So instead of thinking, the world is against me and I resent it, the person becomes the person who thinks, I am a sinful, broken thing. I am in a fallen condition. I am a child of Adam and Eve, right? I have been brought forth in sorrow, and into a family of where my dad seeks his livelihood in the sweat of his brow, right? I'm a thing conceived in sin. I'm sinful from the off. Original sin, right? Now, original sin is like ressentiment in that it's all pervasive and non-specific, right? It's not that you're supposed to feel guilty because of something that Adam and Eve did back in the day. It's rather you're conscious of your brokenness and your overall sinful character and your need for redemption, right? So what's happened, what the ascetic priest has done, is convinced you that the problem is you, right? The man of ressentiment thinks that everything is wrong and everything is broken, but he directs this outwards. The person of, but by the time the ascetic priest has got to work, that has been internalized. That's part of this general process that we find in Nietzsche of the internalization of what were otherwise social conditions, right? Things go from social to being psychological. That direction of travel is all the way through Nietzsche, and it continues here. Okay. Yeah. So convinces man that you yourself are to blame for yourself, right? So the invention of sin, and he tells us in section 20 of the third essay that sin is the name for the priestly reinterpretation of the animal bad conscience, right? So this process of internalization is prepared by the instinct for cruelty turning back on itself, that the tamed, domesticated, when man is tamed and domesticated, loses the opportunity to inflict cruelty on other people systematically. I mean, you can still make cutting remarks, but it's not the same, right? Well, then you have to be cruel to yourself, and this expands the human soul, right? Remember, Nietzsche has this picture where the human soul was previously kind of flat and becomes three-dimensional as a result of having to split and have a sufferer and a torturer, right, within itself. Yeah, so the soul becomes multiple and therefore becomes interesting. Well, the ascetic priest comes along and reinterprets all this as sin. Okay. Now, so this sounds like, priests are bad. This sounds like good old-fashioned Enlightenment anti-clericalism, right? The idea that the clergy are the root of all our troubles is, particularly in the French Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, the 18th century Enlightenment, really has three nationalities: French, German, and Scottish. So you've got Voltaire and Rousseau and the French scene. You've got Kant in Germany, and then in Scotland you've got Adam Smith and David Hume. Well, we say the Scottish Enlightenment. We should really speak of the Edinburgh Enlightenment. I'm not sure how far it got outside of Edinburgh. But anyway, the idea that the priests are the source of all our trouble, it was, is part of the Enlightenment worldview. So you have fine Enlightenment slogans like, in every village there is a torch, the teacher, and an extinguisher, the priest. Or, mankind will only be free when the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest, right? Those are good Enlightenment sentiments, and you might think that this diatribe against the ascetic priest from Nietzsche is just more of that. But, remember what I was saying at the outset about the will to truth, because what the Enlightenment opposes to priestcraft is science, right? So the Enlightenment comes along, and this is why we have on the slides there's a picture of Richard Dawkins, There he is, bit younger and less mad than he is now, but still. And so you might think this, but Nietzsche's going to look at them, the people who put science as the natural opposition for the ascetic priest. Say, no. They are just the latest manifestation of the ascetic ideal. What do scientists do? What do scientists do is they dedicate themselves to something which is not in this world, right? The truth, the scientific truth, isn't something that you can encounter, because science is an endless process. Right now, we don't have the truth about gravity. We have some theories about gravity, but they don't connect with our best theories about quantum mechanics as well as they need to. So on we go. And what do scientists do? They, for the most part, unless they manage to sell get lucky with the textbook sales, most scientists live in relative poverty given their level of education, and they chip away at a program without necessarily having any hope of seeing the thing realized. So most scientists don't make a big breakthrough. Most scientists just go to work each day and do a little bit more, and it's like marking the hours in a monastery, right? So Nietzsche, scientists and scholars, a regular target of Nietzsche's invective. From if you read all of Schopenhauer's Educator, you'll find him ranting away about scholars. And basically, for Nietzsche, they come in two sorts. There are the happy functionaries who don't really have ideals, but they found some kind of satisfying routine. You can pop into work. So they're like the last man, right? So there's a form of scholar or scientist who is a kind of academic version of the last man, that you've found some satisfying little collection of puzzles, and you can enjoy reading about something obscure, becoming an expert on almost nothing, have the satisfaction of knowing more about your tiny corner of the world of scholarship than anybody else, and solving little puzzles that have no interest to you, to anyone except from you and a small number of other scholars. There's a poem by Betjeman called The Wickermist, which is all about a young man who realizes his own mediocrity at an early age and deals with it by becoming an expert on Norman fonts. I think he means baptismal basins rather than typefaces, right? But it wouldn't matter either way, right? So this guy knows that he's not going to do anything, so he makes himself a satisfying existence, happily trudging along, being an expert on Norman fonts, tiny little corner of ecclesiastical architecture. So that's kind of like the last man, because remember what Nietzsche says about the last man's work, that it's undemanding and entertaining, that it doesn't involve great sacrifice. You just work hard enough at it that it should pass the time agreeably, right? Norman fonts. Oh, I think I'll pop up to Ely Cathedral and have another look at the font there, right? Have some lunch on the way. Then you've got the other kind of scientist and scholar. These are the people who are in the grip of the latest and last version of the ascetic ideal, right? These are the people who really believe in truth and who willingly sacrifice themselves in service of the truth, whatever it is, regardless of whether knowing it will help them to flourish. Remember, this is a thought that Nietzsche presents us with. It says, well, maybe the truth isn't good for us, right? Somebody, I can't remember who, says that mankind can only bear so much reality, right? Most of us are less popular than we believe ourselves to be, right? We all have a natural psychological disposition to imagine ourselves to be more popular than we really are. We're also hopelessly optimistic, right? We all expect the near and middle future. We know, I mean, you kind of know that eventually you'll grow old and ill and die, but we expect the time between now and then to go rather well. Even though, if you look at the sort of the statistics, you look at a classroom full of people, for example, you know that it isn't going to turn out well for all, just statistically, right? But we don't know whose life is going to go badly after they graduate, and in particular, we don't know that it'll be us, and so we, take it that it'll be fine, right? And it may be just really important for our flourishing that we hang on to these illusions. It may be that somebody who had the clearest sighted view of their own social condition and of their own prospects in life would actually be mentally ill. I mean, there is some evidence that depressives have a more accurate view of the world than everybody else. What's the causal sequence there? Are they depressed because they see things accurately, or is it that seeing things accurately is it's a sort of side benefit of the depressive condition? Okay, so one of the things that makes Nietzsche different and exciting and interesting is that he doesn't regard scientists and scholars and pursuers of the truth as the opponents of priestcraft, as the kind of Enlightenment picture would have it. Rather, they are in the same game. They are in the business of pursuing the ascetic ideal. So in Beyond Good and Evil, he says, well, is truth really good for us? Philosophers have never really asked this. You just take it that it's a good thing. Why is this? Well, one reason might be that the pursuit of truth is good for philosophers, right? That the idea that the disinterested pursuit of truth is really important is actually one of the highest ideals, if not the highest ideal that humanity can aspire to. Well, that may be, in terms of human flourishing for most humans, that may be really counterproductive. But for these weirdos, scientists and scholars and philosophers, it's great, because it means that the exchequer will fund your scholarly activities, and that people will send their children off to university for you to teach, and the world will demand of you that you write more books and write more articles and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, it's worth having this little distinction in mind. So if you can just no, because Nietzsche is sometimes thought of as a postmodernist, someone who doesn't really believe in truth, but actually he's a kind of perspectivalist. He says, well, actually, truth isn't available to us, but still, the more perspectives you get, the more accurate a sense. So there may be no. Take for example, the causes of the First World War, right? There may not be something called the truth about the causes of the First World War, which we can write down once and for all and seize and say this is the truth about that. But we can look at it from many, many different angles. You can have Marxist version and a economistic version and a kind of classical political history version, kind of diplomatic history version where it's all about the where you tell the story by looking at the exchange of diplomatic letters between the major governments, or you might have a kind of bottom-up history where what's really important is the cultural shifts in populations, so on, right? I mean, you get it, right? So you can the more different angles you look at it from, the richer your understanding. There isn't a final truth of the matter, but that doesn't mean that anything goes and that any other interpretation is as good as any other. So I'm not terribly convinced by the postmodern Nietzsche, if by postmodern we mean kind of crazy relativist. As you'll have gathered from the way I've been setting this up, that what Nietzsche's really criticising is the idea that truth is so valuable that it's worth paying any price. Supposing it turns out that truth is fatal to our society, right? I mean, you can see this in the anxieties people have about traditional beliefs when they're confronted with science. So, for example, one thing that people like to believe is that we have always been here, right? So we have a society with a social order, and maybe a king or a priest emperor or a president or something, and it's part of the ideological background for that whole structure to believe that this is our land, we have always been here, that we originated here. And along come the archaeologists and the linguists and the geneticists, and say, well, actually no, we can tell by linguistic studies and genetic studies and by archaeology that actually you all originated somewhere else and that you migrated into here, and this story about how your society originated in this place is actually an ideological construct. It's not actually true. Well, people always resist that kind of truth-telling. Why? Well, because they can feel that it might be fatal for the good order of their society. Well, supposing that the truth about us, the origins of our society, and and our psychology and so on and so forth. Supposing that if we really got to grips with the facts about the human condition and about the history of our society in particular, supposing that the consequence of that was that it became impossible for us to have any kind of functioning society, but supposing the consequence of that was sort of complete social and ethical breakdown, well, you know, maybe we should hang on to the illusions, right? That's the possibility, and that's one of the reasons why Nietzsche is kind of scandalous, because people tend to believe that the truth will set you free, but will it? Maybe it'd be disastrous. Okay. Well, one of the things that Nietzsche says is that, you know, the idea that the truth will turn out to be valuable for us depends on some kind of metaphysical beyond. Whether it's Plato's forms, or the Kantian thing in itself, or the scientific notion of the world as described by the final scientific theory, which of course is not the world we live in. We live in a world of solid objects. Science tells us that we live in a world of dancing patterns of energy, mostly without empty space. All of these are, in some sense, beyonds, right? Worlds beyond the world that we actually live in, and where we have to try and flourish. So Nietzsche says, well, you know, the reason that the only way you can believe that knowledge of the truth will be good for you is if you think that there is some further reality beyond the kind of empirical everyday world in which we encounter each other and try to flourish, and that this somehow governs our everyday reality in the way in which the forms govern empirical reality, according to Plato, something like that, so that a better understanding of that beyond will somehow make us more effective here and now. That's Plato's story, right? Plato says you need to understand the form of the good in order to live better here. And Nietzsche says that there's got to be some version of that story behind any claim that the truth will be good for you, right? Because the evidence is that the truth, you know, may or may not be good for you, right? The truth about malaria may be good for you if you want to be cured of malaria, but the truth about your social standing may not be good for you if you're trying to be happy. Okay. And there's further thought that, well, what would drive some society to give truth an overwhelming value? Well, one that isn't entirely at ease with itself. One that regards itself as a problem and needs to posit a solution somewhere, right? So, again, back to Plato. Plato is driven by a sense that you know, all is not well with Athens, with the Republic, with his fellow citizens, and he needs to locate the solution for that. It can't be in the here and now, because it's the here and now that's broken, and so the solution must lie somewhere else. The world of forms, the form of the good, all the rest of it, and some version of that must be going on whenever anybody makes this move, right? So Nietzsche thinks that commitment to the value of the truth, come what may, is only possible, is diagnostic of a kind of dissatisfaction with the life you're living, right? Now you might think, of course, that, well, sort of Nietzsche is into strain. Nietzsche is clearly dissatisfied. He does no end of ranting. He thinks that European civilization is sick, is in a terrible state, is in danger of, from the last man, is in danger of collapsing into kind of comfortable lethargy, and he has all this stuff about self-overcoming, self-mastery, hardness with oneself. Well, he says in the, that actually he's fine with the ascetic ideal as long as it's honest, right? So as long as you say to yourself, I am practicing austerity, I am giving up jam today in pursuit of jam tomorrow, that's fine. Because of course one of the differences is that this project of self-creation, of self-mastery, of self-overcoming all takes place in the here and now, with the possible exception of your higher self. Where's that? That might sound a bit like a Platonic form. Right, so for next week, one of the things we want to think about is what happens when you turn all this back on Nietzsche. We return to the hermeneutics of suspicion. Remember, the hermeneutics of suspicion is the idea that there's always something going on. What's really going on? You know, when somebody gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to do some science. I'm going to do some science because I want to know. I value truth for its own sake, and therefore I'm going to do some extremely boring studies. And I'm reconciled to the fact that these studies may not go anywhere in my lifetime, and that the data I collect may only be really useful, you know, years ahead, as part of some much larger mass. Why? Because I'm committed to the value of truth for its own sake, and each is going to say, yeah, there's something going on there. That commitment is clearly in the service of something else. What is that something else? How does that serve your will to power, and so on and so forth, right? Well, you can do all this with Nietzsche, right? It's obvious. You can, once you've got that idea, you say, well, you know, what was Nietzsche driving at with all this stuff? What was driving Nietzsche? All right, so I can't quite see the time on this thing, but it feels like I didn't have the presence of mind to look at my watch at the start, but it feels like I've been talking for quite a long time. So I'll stop, and I hope you'll have a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.